It is an honor and a privilege to be here. And I have a lot of stuff to talk about since I'm trying to cover a period of roughly about 60 years in the span of 45 minutes. So please bear with me if I'm in a little bit of a rush, okay? Because as usual, profs like to talk a lot, right, about very little. So I just want to start off on that. As you all know that the Chandrayaan lander landed on the moon exactly a year ago. And afterwards, it soon deployed a rover. I think it is a tremendous achievement. And as a person who was involved actively in the early part of the space program, I think we are all proud of this great event that our country did. I don't think there is any doubt about the greatness of what we can do if we set our mind to it. So this is one of the things that I thought I should start with. But I think the lander itself and what we can do should also be a time when we have to take stock of what we have done in space and what are the challenges and the kinds of opportunities and challenges that we have to face as we go forward in a world that I think is not exactly the most, what shall we say, generous world outside of it. So this is something that I thought I should try to talk about. And therefore, I'm going to run through a fairly long period in a very short time to give you a flavor of the kinds of problems that countries face, especially countries like India, which are trying to cross the path from being a very old civilization, but also a very poor civilization, into a modern country in which everybody is reasonably well off. I think this is the kind of challenge that we have faced, and that's what I would like to address as we go. Now, Sputnik was launched on October 4th, 1957. And the one thing you must remember about Sputnik is the launch vehicle that put Sputnik into orbit was a modified intercontinental ballistic missile that was meant to carry a nuclear weapon. And therefore, the world of space, the world of missiles, the world of launch vehicles, and the world of nuclear weapons have been kind of connected ever since the dawn of the space age. And even today, they are connected. So whenever we talk about space, we have to always remember that there is a military dimension, there is a security dimension behind everything that goes on in space. So this is one of the things that we have to keep in mind as we look at what India has to do as it goes forward. Why is space important? The main reason why space is important is, can everybody see me? The main reason why space is important is it is a high ground. Now, if you put a platform on a very high ground, you can cover a very, very large part of the Earth's surface, right? And therefore, it provides a strategic advantage. And the military people were one of the earliest in the world, especially the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America. They saw the high ground as a major source of military advantage. So all the early applications that space saw were all related to the military sphere. Okay? And therefore, whoever controls the high ground controls the course of any kind of conflict or war that can come about it. And therefore, space became a very important strategic domain the moment Sputnik was. So the early uses were very important uses. Weather satellites were the first, followed very quickly by what are called navigation or position location satellites, followed soon, right, by communication satellite. The first picture that we took from space was using a television camera, and you can see all the cloud patterns. It's a very coarse resolution picture. You can see all the cloud patterns, and therefore weather prediction, right, the position pick and communication were very important. And of course, soon to follow was to take a picture and find out what is going on, right? So the two superpowers, right, Soviet Union and the United States, both had these reconnaissance satellites in orbit. So the Soviet Union, for the first time, knew what the US was doing. The US knew what the Soviet Union was doing. And therefore, these, what I call reconnaissance satellites, played a very important role in providing stability during the Cold War period. Because the Soviets knew what the Americans were doing, the Americans knew what the Soviets were doing, and therefore this combination was something that the information that was there from these satellites ensured that the Soviet Union didn't think that the US had so many missiles, or the US didn't think that the Russians had so many missiles. So this is so it promoted what I would call a stable regime, because the information for both sides was available to make what I call very rational choices in terms of what decisions they took. And that, I think, was a very major reason why the Cold War eventually didn't explode into a nuclear war. Now, while all this was happening, there was this Indian physicist, Vikram Sarabhai, who's actually originally a cosmic ray physicist, but who got interested in the coupling between what is called the sun's, the sun and the magnetic field of the Earth. The sun emits a lot of particles. It affects the magnetic field directly. And therefore, he was very interested in the impact that these would have on cosmic rays. And therefore, he got interested in looking at some of this. And therefore, he felt that, therefore, doing research related to these things involved launching sounding rockets. And he therefore tied up, he was very well connected with all the US related scientists and all the research institutions in the US. And he therefore decided that he would start something called INCOSPA. The Indian National Committee for Space Research was set up in 1962. It had all these very important scientists at that time. I'm not going into a lot of the detail, but so there was this conglomeration of scientists. And they had all taken part in what is called the International Geophysical Year. That happened along with, when Sputnik was launched, it was launched as a part of a international scientific program called the International Geophysical Year. And India participated in a big way in that scientific event. And the IGI led directly to Vikram Sarabhai going to the US and asking for US help in order to set up a sounding rocket facility in a place called Tumba. And why was Tumba chosen? Because Tumba, the magnetic equator of the Earth is very close to Tumba. And therefore, if you launch rockets from Tumba, you'll be able to understand the impact, right, of understand the impact or the variations in the magnetic field could be better understood if you have a launch site in Tumba. So those were the reasons why these things happen. So this is Tumba, right? And you can see a sounding rocket. Most of the early rockets were bought from the US. So I think we had supplies from France and Europe, as well as from the Soviet Union later. And of course, the US provided the first rocket. The payload was done with French help. So it represented a major international collaboration event, and it set the tone for creating the Tumba complex, or what is called today Vikram Sarabhai Space Center. And it provided the nucleus for all the launch facilities that India would eventually. So Tumba started as a very small place, and it's grown into this huge center that we have today. And therefore, these sounding rockets were soon indigenized by our own people, and then we started producing them in numbers. Now, while all this was happening in the US, a major event happened. They decided that apart from the military applications, which was the focus of all the effort, they needed to move into things that provided more value to society, also more money to people who wanted to make money, right? So it was also opening up new industries to promote what I call the growth of the economy, provide jobs, and also to create a lot of wealth. So one of the early applications that was commercialized was satellite communications. I hope all of you know about the geostationary orbit, right? So satellites in geostationary orbit provide a constant field of view over a very large area of the Earth, and therefore communications between any parts of this geographic area are easily facilitated using a platform in space. And this is ATS-6, which was at that time one of the most powerful communication satellites that was ever launched. And NASA wanted to use this satellite to promote, right, the cause of what it felt was a major application. It was a very high-powered satellite, and they wanted to use it in order to send television signals, right, to parts of the world where education could be a problem. And therefore, they looked at the world and they came to the conclusion that India was a place where such an experiment would make sense. And therefore, they knew Vikram Sarabhai. And because they knew Vikram Sarabhai, NASA and Vikram Sarabhai got into this arrangement. And through INCOSPAR, which was also set up by India at that time, they decided that this satellite instruction television experiment would take place, by means of which the ATS satellite would be moved to a location which was over India. And then they would use this high-powered satellite in order to beam television programs to villages, village community sets across India. So this was one of the largest educational experiments to transform rural areas in the world at that time. And NASA and INCOSPAR, as it was called that day, tied up to come up with this experiment. And as this was happening, of course, the major event that the US was engaged in was, of course, the Apollo landings. You can see here that the Eagle has landed and, the planting of the US flag. So this was one of the most earth-shaking events. And I remember that I think all of us were glued to what was happening. And I remember having a bet with my father who said this is not going to happen. And of course, I won the bet. Right? So it was one of those great events in the world. I think it was watched by a television audience that was, at that time, possibly the highest of 60 million people across the world, something like that. And of course, it was a historic event. Okay. Of course, the other great thing that was a major feature is both the superpowers, maybe because of competition between them, they also sent out these absolutely fantastic scientific missions that kind of explored the whole of the solar system and provided us an enormous amount of information. I think NASA's contribution to the world of knowledge, if anybody wants to look at it, is phenomenal. I think practically everything that we know about the solar system has been modified, changed, and significantly expanded because of these great missions. And one of the missions that all of us remember very clearly was this Voyager mission. I think it is the one that both the Voyager satellites are now in what is called beyond the solar system. They are in interstellar space. I think they are still communicating with the Earth. Okay, this is after 50 years. They're fantastic satellites. Okay, and apart, it's followed by a whole host of other NASA satellites. And the USSR too. USSR did a signal. So here I just want to show you a few things. What you see here are volcanoes on the satellite of Jupiter, Io, right? I think the first known volcanoes outside the Earth were discovered on Io, right? And then, of course, the rings of Saturn are fantastic. I remember Professor Dhawan got a whole set from NASA when I was working with him. You could see these individual planetoids, or moonlets as they call them now, inside the rings. So they had this expanded, absolutely fantastic picture of Saturn and its rings. And it was amazing to see the kind of detail that they got out of it. Okay, so they discovered, I think Saturn has now 146 moons identified, and a whole lot of moonlets that are still being investigated. So it's fantastic kind of discovery. The other thing that, for example, you might want to see is the Great Red Spot, right? Now, this was discovered during Galileo's time, okay? And the Great Red Spot has been there since Galileo's time. Every observation of Jupiter has kind of identified it. It actually turns out it is a huge storm. So imagine a storm in the atmosphere of Jupiter that has been going on for a few hundreds of years. Amazing, right? And of course, there is this probe that went and crashed into Jupiter, all that stuff that they have done, huge amount of things that has happened. Then, of course, you have this other great thing that happened, right? Now, Enceladus is a satellite of Saturn, right? And you have these geysers, just as you have volcanoes on Io, you have these geysers. These are ice geysers that are coming out of the satellite, of this moon of Saturn. Fantastic picture. And then, of course, you have this incredible discovery. Titan is, I think, the largest moon in the solar system. And it has these, what I call the methane lakes. All these things that you see in dark are all methane lakes, right? So it has these stockpiles of methane. So you're looking at energy. Can you go to Jupiter and get hydrogen? Can you go to Titan and get methane? Right? So you have all these opportunity spaces. There are lots of asteroids, a lot of which have very rich cobalt and some of these very difficult minerals. So there's a whole lot of work that people are talking about in order to kind of explore this, mine it, and use it. I'll talk about it later at the end. So this is something that I think was one great contribution to the world of knowledge. And but while the world of knowledge is important, we also have to remember there are other parts of the space program that we have to worry about. Because this is Sarabhai died in 1971. He had this great vision, but unfortunately he died well before any of this vision could actually become hardcore products and services or the reality of what we can do with space. And it is left to Dhawan to create what I would call the framework and the architecture for what ISRO would become and what ISRO can do in today. So what he did and what he set up, in my opinion, you can actually trace a lot of what is ISRO doing directly to what he had initiated when he was the chairman of the space program. And I had the good fortune to work very closely with him. So what you are hearing a little bit is more of a, shall we say, a reasonably close first-hand account of what happened. And how did he see the world? He saw it as a system of interconnected, what I call complex interconnected systems. And one of the problems in complex interconnected systems, how do you weave them all together in order to provide something of value? And he came up with these notions that projects and programs, projects and interconnected projects, which he called programs, are the ways in which you can transform all these resource base of capabilities into something that has value for society. So if you look at it, ISRO and the space program and many complex systems. So this space is not the only complex system in the world. I think building an electric vehicle is also pretty complicated. So the point I'm really saying is that, to be able to take all these capabilities and constraints and, design something and make it work and use it is something that I think he came up with. And a lot of credit has to be given to Professor Dhawan, and that's why I think he should be the architect of what the space program is today. And of course, the first thing that we did was what I call look at this satellite instruction television experiment. So we conducted this enormous, huge activity, right, which extended across a lot of rural India. We had about, I think, 3,000 villages where we went and installed these sets and we beamed these education programs, and then we evaluated them. So all this happened. And, Arthur Clarke was closely associated with that. So we actually set up a special set for him to receive the programs in Sri Lanka. Arthur Clarke, of course, came up with the notion of geostationary orbit. First guy to say, if we put a satellite in this altitude, it will constantly look at a given part of the world. He was the architect. I don't know whether any of you have read his science fiction. Have any of you seen 2001 Space Odyssey? He's written some of the greatest science fiction stuff that anybody can read. I would urge all of you to go and take a look at some of the stuff. Fantastic. Okay. So please do that. So I'm a great fan. I've read a lot of his stuff. And so we all met him. Great guy. And then what did Dhawan do? So Aryabhatta was the first satellite. We launched it with the help of the Soviet Union, right? And then the second satellite we did was a remote sensing satellite, Earth observation, taking a picture from space and then using it to do a lot of things on the ground was obviously a major thing. And then from there, over a period of time, we did something called the IRS satellite, in which again I think we were. So this was the first, this was the second, and this is the third, which has a very capable. It's a very capable remote sensing satellite. So from a 1 kilometer resolution in 1979, we actually created IRS-1C, which had a 5-meter resolution in 1995. And in 16 years, we had moved from practically being nowhere to being the best in the world. Between 1995 and 2000, ISRO had it had the best resolution civilian satellites in the world. Okay. So it's not a small achievement. And the cameras, we built a whole string of cameras. I don't want to go into a lot of technical detail, the data rates, the image processing, all of that. We have terrific capabilities in ISRO to do this even today. So we came up with, sorry. The cameras, we built a whole cameras. So we came up with this 1 meter resolution camera, right, which at that time was state of the art around 2000 or so. We had to reach that state of art. And today, too, the remote sensing value chain is one where we are pretty good at. Okay? And I think we are world class. To give you an idea, this is Bangalore from Cartosat. To put off the lights a little bit, you can see a lot of detail. That's obviously the stadium that you can see, right? So that is a stadium, right? A Cubbon Park and all that is, you can see the Cubbon Park. It's a very, if you do a lot of work with it, it can produce, you can do a lot of stuff. It's very high resolution, good capability. And then, of course, we can also take pictures of the other parts of the world, just as they are taking pictures over our part of the world. To give you an example of what we could do at that time, let me show you. So here is a picture of IRS taken over Washington, okay? And once again, you can see that it's for that time, it was a fantastic picture. Yeah. And the second value chain that Dhawan addressed was what I call the communication value chain. So we started with Apple, which was an indigenously built geostationary communications satellite. It's a very simple satellite, 2 transponders. And then we bought the INSAT-1 satellite. We bought 4 of them. And then we built up from these, we built up so we built INSAT-2, right? And we launched it in 1992. This was completely built by us, and this was launched in 1992. Yeah. And along with that, we also established a very major communication ground segment. Now, the INSAT was unique in one other way. It was the first satellite that carried commercial satellite or an application satellite that not only carried a communication and TV payload, it also carried a weather instrument. Now, putting a weather instrument along with a communication instrument and operating it in JSO is complicated. And I think we choose to do that for a variety of reasons, mainly driven by Indian requirements and the fact that India could not afford to have 2 separate satellites for this. So it's one of the first times in the world where these missions have been combined. And INSAT was actually a very unique multi-mission satellite. And you can see, for example, that INSATs provided this information on the cyclone. And we set up these early warning systems along all the coastline of India so that you can take these pictures, take a sequence of these pictures, track the movement of the cyclone, predict where it's going to hit the coastline, and then again use the INSAT communication links to directly connect to a lot of these early warning systems that are located along the coastline. It was one of the reasons that was used to justify the cost of the INSAT satellite when Professor Dhawan first took it up and got it approved by the government. So this was like a unique requirement of that time, which resulted in a very specialized, customized satellite, which India then was able to build on its own. Okay. Again, I think it represented a major step forward in this endeavor. Then, of course, you have so you have a number of satellites in place catering to the various needs of India. Many of them are co-located. We came up with some new approaches in order to make this co-location possible. I'm not going into the detail. I have a lot of stuff to cover, so let me push. And what did INSAT do? Now, this slide gives you the dollar cost per circuit year, which is a measure of the cost of communication. Now, Intelsat was what I call the international entity that was providing the best service. And you can see the costs of the international costs have come down over a period of time as satellite technology has increased. India was able to provide it at less than $2,000, which is about half or less than half the price of the global system. So not only did we have a competitive product, we also had a very competitive price. I think that was, again, something that I think we should be extremely proud of. And then, of course, we looked at the launch of value chain. We started with SLV3, moved on to ASLV, which is a variant of SLV3. And then, of course, we built this fantastic vehicle called the Polar Satellite Launch Vehicle. And Polar Satellite Vehicle, you can see that we have, in the period, we increased our launch capability by approximately 1,500 kg. So this was, again, a Dhawan initiative and a Dhawan. And all this was possible only because of one factor, right? And the factor was the Cold War. The Cold War gave us a relatively stable international environment. And because of that stability, we were able to, what shall we say, get help from both the Soviet Union, Aryabhatta, Bhaskara were launched by the Soviet Union. USA site was done. A lot from the French. We got technology from the French to build the PSLV, the second stage of PSLV. All this was possible in what is called the sanctuary regime in space, right? This ended when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And then we moved into a different global regime that fundamentally altered a lot of the things that we could do and what was possible. So this is the Sarabhai-Dhawan regime in which the basic edifice was built for the space program. That's just to show you, right, the overall sanctuary regime. So from military uses, it has gone into civilian uses, as you can see. And economic agenda is becoming more and more important. Nuclear weapons and conventional weapons were always related, but national power now also requires a significant component of space, right? Not only nuclear weapons and conventional, but also space-related stuff, okay? And this was also the time when the world saw the emergence of all the space laws that we have today, every international space accord. It also saw serious arms limitation agreements between the USSR and the US. So it was a time when the world was significantly a much more benign environment. Now, this changed very quickly. As I said, once the US became the most dominant power, it had always been against India's rocket program because it saw a connection between the SLV3 launcher and missile program. It did not want India to build a ballistic missile or any kind of missile that would carry a nuclear weapon. It did not want India to do that. And therefore, when India signed a contract with Russia to get a cryogenic engine, which you could then put on the PSLV, on top of the PSLV, to convert it into a geosynchronous launch vehicle that could launch meaningful communication satellites, they decided that they would kind of take action. So they persuaded Russia to cancel the cryogenic engine deal. So this set back the launch vehicle program of India significantly. Okay, I think it is one of the major changes that marked the period after the end of the Cold War. And as this was going on, there was another revolution in the technology space. Small satellites, not only small satellites, but also large constellations of small satellites became an important component of a new offering that could significantly enhance not only the reconnaissance and remote sensing capabilities, but also the communications capabilities. So you had all these constellations, Starlink, OneWeb, all of them came out of this kind of change post 2000. Okay, so these things. So they kind of reduced the entry barriers and the cost for anybody to be able to afford space. It also gave a new business opportunity for people to build these satellites and to be able to use them and provide value-added services. All of that became possible. And this is just one example of what is called a company called OneWeb. I think Bharati owns a significant part of this network now. Okay, they bought it. Now, as this was happening post 2000, a major change was happening in the world space order, and it was the emergence of China, right? I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. China decided on a human spaceflight program in the early 90s. And by the early 2000s, they had actually done a lot of this. And the first Chinese astronaut went into space. They built a space station. Okay, so this is a model of the spacecraft that they did. And they built, so there was also this, what I call the orbital module, right, which was left behind in orbit. Then there was this re-entry module. So this is a typical kind of human spaceflight program thing. And of course, you can see they also built a space station called the Tiangong Space Lab, and they tried to put people on it and occupy it for a certain time. Since then, they have moved into setting up a permanent space station. And apart from the US, China is the only other country that has an operating space station. And the space station provides an opportunity for people to do all kinds of experiments and put it there and see what happens in space. And they have these two huge rockets. The first of them is much smaller, of course. This was the 2F rocket, which they put the first humans into space. And this is the CZ5, which is actually used a lot for both the lunar exploration, Mars exploration programs, as well as for the human spaceflight programs. They have a huge lunar exploration program. They are the first country to go behind the dark. So they have explored the dark side of the moon. They have a rover on the dark side of the moon. They also have a communication satellite at what is called the Lagrangian point, which enables communication from the dark side of the moon to come to the Earth. So they have in place a great infrastructure to be able to do all these outstanding things related to their loop. They've also sent, I think, a mission to Mars. And of course, the other thing they did was in 2007, they launched a missile to destroy one of their old weather satellites. And they showed what is called an anti-satellite weapon. They demonstrated an anti-satellite weapon. And they followed this up with a significant enhancement of their what is called intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability, right? Which means that they have a number of satellites that can constantly monitor, right, the world, and then figure out what is happening. So these are all very major capabilities, and the Chinese have gone ahead and done a lot of the military buildup associated with making sure that they are. So this is a typical example of how, as one satellite goes, another satellite will take over. That's the coverage area. As one goes and the coverage, another satellite will come and take over the coverage. So they have these constellation of satellites, which enables constant surveillance. So India, you can assume, is under constant surveillance from Chinese satellites. We did a calculation and we have some data. I think more than 90% of the time, Bangalore, for example, will be under constant observation. Any military activity can be identified. And of course, so as this was happening, India continued with all its INSAT satellites. These are the INSAT 4 series of satellites. And if you look at a comparison between what we were and what we are now, see, the world had moved from what I call the medium kind of satellites to heavy and extra heavy satellites during this period. And we had a presence only in the medium and intermediate. We need to move from the intermediate to the heavy and extra heavy. Okay. In the remote sensing area, we moved operationally. I think now we have even a sub-meter capability. And you can see these are the 3 periods in which we can look at this evolution. On the launcher side, the GSLV Mark I was not so good. It was using the Russian cryo. We have moved to GSLV Mark III, which uses an indigenously developed cryogenic engine. You can't see this part, but this is the cryogenic steel and the satellite. And of course, we are thinking of moving to another launcher in order to do more things. But we still haven't moved beyond GSLV Mark III. This is the operational vehicle. I think for most of the Chandrayaan missions, we have used these. And of course, we have the lunar exploration program, right? Chandrayaan, Aditya, all the science mission, making a lot of news in the world. Right? And Chandrayaan 3, as we saw, is one of the great successes. And then, of course, we have the manned spaceflight program, right? Human spaceflight program, correct? And these are the 4 astronauts who are going to fly. And of course, we did the so-called ASAT test. Okay. And we launched, just as the Chinese did a test, we launched a missile and broke up one of the satellites that we had launched. Of course, we did. So let me come back and try and wrap this up. 5 more minutes. So what am I trying to say through all this? So one thing I think we have to accept is space is an important source of national power, right? Countries see space as very important, as making a very important contribution to their. The US believes it, the Chinese believe it, the Russians believe it, the French believe it, everybody who matters in the space world believes it, okay? But it has many components. One component is the economic component, right? Should we do space largely for economic development is a question that we should ask ourselves. There is also a major challenge. China is a major enemy, right? We also have to seriously worry about whether we can defend ourselves against the Chinese attack. And if China attacks India, space would have a major role to play if India has to defend ourselves. So should we put money into the military part? I would argue there is a connection between putting money in the military part and economic development, because a lot of the early developments in space happened because military programs are funded. They created the impetus for the transition into the civilian domain. And therefore, public good and public expenditure basis for doing a lot of this is one thing that can drive the way in which not all governments can look at space. The third part is obviously to use space for political purposes. Now, if you look at the history, the launching of a satellite was largely a political decision. And then it transformed itself into an economic. So should we show to the world that India is a major country? Should we, therefore, the logic of putting a man in space or sending something to the moon or doing something that other people have not done before adds a lot of prestige and a lot of value, and it's largely political in nature. So it establishes India as a great power, right? Does it? Or is it economic power more important, military power more important? I think these are issues that we should debate and ask ourselves, right? And of course, there is knowledge power, right? Nobody can deny that the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge is the most important, or it's the most noble of whatever we can do, right? And that, I think, is something we should keep in mind. So all of it is therefore, so we have all these components of power, right? So what should we do? How should India go forward? I think this is the question that we need to ask ourselves. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief presentation of the world power as it was, the space order. So one way to look at the relative standing of all countries is to look at the number of operating satellites they have. The world had in 2021 April or 2020, 2021 April, it had about 408 operating satellites, right? 2,505 of them belong to the US, 431 belong to China. I think India had 61. So that will tell us relatively where we stand in the overall rankings as far as one simple measure of looking at how we are in the world stage. So if we can put this together on, so if you look at it, is in what I would call, it's still growing. It's still in the growth phase. It is still to reach what is called the maturity part of its life cycle. So there's an evolutionary perspective. Life cycles are used a lot in high technology products industry. So this is that. So the US is obviously the top of the list. China is a little behind. The lead between the China and the US is actually widening. US is moving ahead quite fast ahead of China. Russia is a kind of declining space power. Europe is there, but it's certainly not even as close to China as one would like. France is quite big. Japan too is quite big, and India is actually quite a bit behind when you look at the current structure of the world space. So we still have a long way to go before we can come here. So this is one part that we have to keep in mind. And of course, the other thing that we have to keep in mind, we live in a world of information, right? And space are not only collectors of information, they also are transmitters of information through complex networks. So critical nodes in any information-based network. Okay. So if you destroy an early warning satellite or a communication satellite, a lot of things can happen to the ground networks that we use. And you can argue, therefore, that the role that nuclear weapons, conventional weapons, right, and space weapons are now going to become interconnected into a holistic kind of complex interconnection of possibilities. And obviously, therefore, civilian uses and military uses, there are very little distinction between them, blurring, right? So it becomes even more complex. You can use open source information for a lot, or open source communication for a lot of things that we want to do today, right? So we are therefore looking at a very complex system, right? And space is a significant part of this complexity, especially when you are looking at war and conflict. And therefore, there is a major challenge for a country like India to be able to protect itself adequately. So this is a major requirement. If you look at China and what they are capable of, you see all of it is green. So they have all these reconnaissance satellites, they have navigation satellites, they have weather satellites, they have all these communication satellites that can take data from all over the world and make sure that it reaches all the locations within China. They have this, what I call ground network of various assets that can connect up and do whatever it is. They have command centers, and these are all linked to operating units, Navy units, Air Force units, right, Army, etc., in a kind of complex interconnected network. And they also have the missile power. They have all the other assets in order to be able to wage and win what they call local war under conditions of informationalization. That's what they call it, right? So they are now fully capable. If you look at India, on the other hand, you see a lot of reds, right? We have capabilities in some areas, but we have a lot of reds that we have to worry about. And this requires significant investment, not only on the ground, but also we need a lot of investments in the space. Okay. And so we have done some work on trying to put some numbers on this. So I'm just going to give you a very quick number count. We can look at a lot of detail. It's based on some detail. We need about 111 satellites, okay, right, in the next 5 to 7 years. we need about 50, about 70, 80 launch vehicles in the next 5 to 7 years, right? ISRO can do about 5, 7, 8, 10 at the most. We need to grow that number, right? How do we grow it? We need an industry, right? How do we create that industry? I think is one huge challenge. Now, if you look at the transponder demand over India, I think the demand is met by imported transponders or outside transponders. About 60% of the demand is outside transponders. We don't have Indian-built transponders on Indian satellites over India, right? If you look at remote sensing area, all the applications that I have used, none of them originates in India, right? I use Google Earth, I use everything else comes from abroad, right? We need a huge opportunity space to do all the remote sensing part, right? So we do have a huge opportunity space, not only the commercial part, but the military part. And it goes beyond just the satellite part, but we need satellites, we need rockets, we need industrial capacity, right? And what should we do, therefore, in order to be able to create this? Of course, the question to ask is, do we really need to do this at all or not, is obviously a question to ask. I would just like to raise these questions to all of you, because the younger generation does not seem to be aware of some of these challenges. So I think we should ask ourselves, what is it that we want to be, and how is it that we want to pursue that place where we want to be? I think this is really what I want to communicate, right? And we have achieved a fair amount of, as I said, if you look at the history of what ISRO is today or what India is today, a lot of it is there. We have the potential. How do we grow this potential? How do we convert it into a national space ecosystem? It's not an ISRO ecosystem. It should be an India ecosystem where industry has a significant role, right? The Chinese industry has done well. American industry has done fantastic. Europe is doing extremely well. You look at all the other countries in the world which are space powers, I think we haven't done very well. I think, therefore, we need to ask, what is our priority? How do we go about doing it? And what is the kind of approach or the strategy that we should employ in order to be able to make that happen? I think that is really the message that I want to get across. So my point again is, if you look at these dimensions of power, right? Obviously, political power, the man in space is a political gesture. I think a lot of the things we do in the, we are the first to land on the south pole of the moon, right? Is political, I feel, to a larger extent. Of course, it adds to the world of question. So economic power, I think, is critical to doing everything else in the power business. So obviously, development, which is what Dhawan and Sarabhai wanted. How far are we? Have we really used the potential to the maximum to push the development part? The military part, I think we have to worry about our national security. China is not an empty threat. It's not going to go away. I'm not sure they are very friendly towards India. Should we ignore it, or should we do something about it? I think these are also two challenges that we have to ask. So we have to ask ourselves these hard-headed questions. What is it that we want to be? Where are we? And how do we actually get there? I think these are the questions I feel are important. I'm not sure that the current discussions ever address any of this in detail. I mean, I'm very proud of Chandrayaan, but at the same time, I'm also not very sure whether we are headed in the right direction as far as the future is concerned. So we need to ask ourselves this question, debate, and then come up with a. I think Indian industry is very powerful. I don't think we have used it effectively in creating a viable space ecosystem. And then finally, I would like to end. The world is very divided today. And when I was working in ISRO, it was a better world. It was not a perfect world. It was a better world. Okay. Now, one of the things of that better world, in my opinion, reflected how the USSR and the USA cooperated on many things. Even today, they cooperate on the space station. The earlier days, for example, the Russians used to supply the ferry that would take supplies to the space station. Even that they do today. But at that time, there was this Apollo-Soyuz program that the two astronauts, both countries actually put together. They kind of docked together, and they had this exchange. And it was one of the, what I call the high points of the Cold War. And they did not object. For example, us getting help from the Soviet Union to launch Aryabhatta and Bhaskara. They objected, but they did not completely stop the French from giving us the Viking rocket engine. They did not, right? So there was this, I would argue, and if you look at the legacy of the cooperation, I tend to believe that the cooperative networks at the scientific level in those days was significantly better. Therefore, science, in my opinion, or the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, is a very, very important component to make sure that nation states can also learn to understand and live with each other. So I am always inspired by this gold record. This was put on the 2 Voyager spacecraft. And these are the first 2 spacecraft to venture into beyond the solar system, into interstellar. So they had this record, and they had this famous message. It said, "This is a present from a small, distant world, a token of our sounds, our science, our images, our music, our thoughts, and our feelings. We are attempting to survive our time so we may live into yours." Right? And it was signed by Jimmy Carter, who was then the president of the United States. It provides an opportunity. So the IGI, in which Vikram Sarabhai participated, was another example. We had something called the monsoon experiment, or MONEX, again, a lot of this. So maybe we should also look at one way of improving is to look at, I don't know whether China and India and US and Russia can work together on sending a mission to Mars, right? So what I see now is the competition for the moon. Everybody wants to go there. There are a lot of resources on the moon. I want to see whether I can exploit them, right? That seems to be the driving logic of a lot of it. So can we revert to a more benign? I don't think countries are going to be perfect, friends all the time. But can we move from what I think a very, very, what shall we say, a very, very hostile cooperation framework into a more benign one? I think that is the question we need to ask ourselves.
Thank you, sir, for the very educational speech. We'll have a short Q&A session for anyone who has.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
It was very informative. I had actually 2 small queries. One is, why do Chinese satellites are more prone to accidents? Because we hear frequently that they are about to fall somewhere or say trouble the whole world. That's one question. Why is it so and not so from any other country? And second question is, does it matter the number of objects that are rotating or the quality of data that is coming to us?
Okay. So let me come back to the first question. Okay. When you put an object into space, there is a possibility, a satellite, for example, there is a possibility that something can go wrong, right? And it is very difficult for anybody to do anything with it. Now, what you're hearing about the Chinese satellites and their re-entries, Tiangong was one. And I think there's another case where I think the spent stage of a rocket was also coming back. So the Tiangong they were not able to control the Tiangong. Now, this is not new in space. So let me go back and give you a little bit of history. Sputnik, of course, is much higher. So small satellites don't have a problem. Okay. It's only these huge structures that have a problem. Small satellites, as soon as they enter the atmosphere, they break up and kind of diffuse. Okay. So they don't have it. So the US launched Skylab in 6, right? And Skylab, they lost control, right? And Skylab, therefore, they couldn't control it, and it was due to re-enter. The NASA issued this global warning. India was on the path. And one reason why India signed the liability convention immediately was at that time we had not ratified the liability convention. And I was there when all this happened. And we actually ratified the convention in 1 day or 2 days. It did, but the path, see, you can't predict as it comes. You can't exactly predict. So there'll be a huge path that they will give. But India was on the path. This is one example. The second example I'd like to give you is the Russians had a reconnaissance satellite, a nuclear-powered reconnaissance satellite. Okay. So radars on nuclear powered satellites provide real-time ocean-related, so ships and aircraft carriers and all that, they would be able to find out. And they had this constellation of them. One of them failed, okay, and they couldn't control it. It crash landed over Canada, spread nuclear debris over the whole of Canada. So I was there at the UN when all this was happening. I was also there at that time, okay. And I remember it was created a huge furore. And, so all kinds of, they said we must have a convention, all that was happening. And finally, what they said was, I think Russia, Soviet Union and Canada settled it out of court. Okay. So this is the other example. So my argument is India has had several examples. You may not have known about it. We had a satellite called RISAT. It's a radar satellite, synthetic aperture radar satellite. It had these huge solar panels. Okay. And what happened is it had this phenomenon called shredding. So which means it shred a lot of debris and a lot of it was polluting space. Okay. So we have not reported it, but other people in the world have reported it. Okay, so that is the other kind of thing. And I think a PSLV upper stage blew up in space. Just as it was coming down, it blew up, created a lot of debris. So my point is, accidents will happen. There is a possibility that some of these large structures will come down. I think that's reality. And no nation state is going to stop doing it because of these problems. There is a legal regime and there is a liability convention where there is some protection. But again, all international law is subject to national decisions. So I think they are very weak regimes, but at least they exist. So as I said, we signed the liability convention because we were worried that we didn't have a legal basis to go and claim damages, etc. So the point I'm making is, yeah, these things will happen. So complex systems, according to me, the law is complex systems will always fail. They may not fail for a long time, but at some point they will.
So thank you, sir, for very interesting insights. So my question is regarding the anti-satellite missiles. Do countries have a defense mechanism against the ASAT missiles? And does India have?
So to protect a satellite from a missile attack, you need what is called an intelligence satellite. Okay, right? So if you need an intelligence satellite, you need to put in a lot of stuff on them. I think a lot of countries are working on it, all secret, right? So you must be able to identify a launch, and as it comes close to you, you must be able to find out and then do a maneuver in order to avoid it. Yeah, it's possible. Technically doable, expensive, difficult, but doable.
I had a question.
Quick one.
Yeah, sure. So, like you mentioned, that space is a point of interest for the government, the political sides of things, even the military. And mostly they are the funding agencies in these cases, a lot of times. Or all the funding agencies, they have some sort of a vested interest in certain aspects, let's say. As a scientist working in it, so how do you balance this with the quest for knowledge, right? Because as scientists, somewhere down the line, you want to do that, right? Knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And the funding agency usually will not have that as their primary agenda. So how, because you are somebody working in that, how would you balance it?
See, my argument is, I would call, I don't know whether you've read this book called Pastures Quadrant. It may be worth going and looking at it. Okay, pasture. So there are these different quadrants. Bohr, for example, looked at knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I think some part of our public good concept should make investments in the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, right? So we must support the Bohr quadrant, no question about it. And there should not be too many ties. And funding agencies can also, for example, DST should, in my opinion, provide some significant amount of money to do that with no questions asked. US has multiple agencies doing it, and they do a reasonable job. Maybe not always great, but they do support in a significant way fundamental concepts. So some parts of any large country like India, we must do that without any question. The second part is what I call the pastures quadrant. Pasteur did only work related to application, a lot of his work. It also created new science. So, right. So in the Pasteur quadrant, I think we have two sources of money, right? One is the government, the other is industry. Now, what the US and China and all have done, maybe the US much more, they, in the initial part of the space program, they put in a lot of effort. The first communication experimental satellites were all government funded. The moment they became viable, right, they also created a demand in industry. The defense would buy 15 satellites, right? So the companies that built them actually got the contracts and they converted that. And then eventually they became significantly better than the government in pushing the knowledge and the technology. So there you're looking at applied, you're looking at business, you're looking at societal applications, right? You're looking at all of that. And that I think is important. Then you have the other quadrant, which is, the part that is like Edison, right? You don't really worry about knowledge. You're only worried about solving your problem and making money. And then, of course, the fourth quadrant is you don't know which one of them or what you want to be, right? So these are, I would argue, so to answer your question in a very simple way, we should support and we should do it without any questions asked. We are under-investing in knowledge. India being much more wealthy than the world, we should do more. But let me tell you, the R&D budget has remained 0.7% ever since I can remember. Over the last 30, 40 years, we have not had a significant expansion. The Chinese are putting in 2.5%, Americans are about 3% or 4%. So we need more money, even for fundamental research.
So I'd like to thank the speaker, Professor Chandrashekar, for this illuminating talk. I would now like to request Registrar Ambrose Sridhar to give him a token of appreciation. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much.